Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dr. Larry Arnn is my guest. He is president of Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. We are back into the world crisis. And I got to say, Dr. Arnn, every time I pick this up and get ready for one of our conversations, and we're doing a chapter a week, I'm amazed that I've never read this book closely. This is a great book.
Oh, yeah. He's the greatest. I want to say a word about why to read this book. I'm noticing rereading volume 1 of this book, and it's a big effort to work your way through it. But it's first of all, it's a tremendous political education.
Yes.
It's this is a master statesman who's reflecting on these critical times, on the traumas of the world are vastly compounded by World War I and the steps leading up to it. And Churchill dates those steps to 15 years before the First World War. And he just sees that he early in the second chapter, he talks about a great old man named Sir William Harcourt, who was a distinguished liberal politician, kind of academic, not the most effective guy, but very distinguished, let's say. And Churchill says he had the privilege of talking to him. And Churchill kept saying, Churchill was young, and Churchill was a ball of fire all his life, but especially when he was young. And he keeps saying, what's going to happen? And Sir William Harcourt says, a long life has taught me that nothing ever happens.
That's in the third paragraph. Winston Churchill is winking at the reader throughout this. And right before he says that, he says, in the course of a conversation which I took, I fear, none too modest to share. That's very amusing, right? He's blabbering on as a youngster with William Harcourt there, a Victorian statesman of great eminence. And he gets his comeuppance.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Churchill says in the next sentence, since then it seems to me nothing has ever ceased to happen. So it's, the world is becoming turbulent, and I'll remind our listeners that in the first chapter he describes how powerful the world had become. And that's one of the themes of his life. We are extremely, on my trip, by the way, I'm shocked to say it and was amazed to hear it. We just had our 20th cruise.
Wow.
And I've never been on a cruise except a Hillsdale College cruise, so I really only go on cruises to work. It's a joyful kind of work, but it's work. And over the years, what's happened? Well, first of all, you can communicate now about as well on a cruise ship or any port you stop in as you can at home. And that's huge, right?
It's also dire, because like you, I've done them only for work over 20 years. And the ability to reach people at sea has grown exponentially, and therefore your work never stops.
Never stops. And then on the other hand, and that's a blessing if you want to do your work, which most of the time I do. But on the other hand, that's also concentration of power. C.S. Lewis writes in The Abolition of Man that air travel doesn't make the individual person more powerful, purely. It also makes him what he calls a patient, that is to say, subject to the forces that produce the airplane and run the airline and take you where you want to go or somewhere. And, right now air travel is harder than it's been in my experience And that means that are we more powerful because of that? Well, not purely, right? And that means, by the way, that if it pleases them, Google and Facebook and everybody knows where I am all the time.
All the time. By the way, I'm looking at Chapter 3 when he was setting up the first Navy staff, a war staff for the Navy Department, for the Admiralty. And he goes to great pains to assure the naval officers, I'm not turning your service upside down. So sea power is very different from land power because the communication is instant. So, as opposed to on the land. And I'm thinking, boy, has that ever accelerated? What would Churchill think about today? Every commander in every field and every battle is connected with the Situation Room. It's kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, and they can see, right? They can see what you see now. And that means, is the status of the commander reduced? And, one of Churchill's great themes in life and mine now is centralization is dangerous, right? What's happened to education? We think that unless we have slightly more people administering education than we have people teaching in it, then it can't be good. But the truth is, those people are in the way, because the way people learn, if the learning starts in the student, and if the teacher, somebody who knows and who loves enough to spend his time with the young of whatever age, helping them, well, in that room is everything you need. And so now what we've got is bureaucratic plans, and we teach teachers in ed centers, ed schools now. I get in trouble for saying that they're the dumbest parts of the dumbest colleges, but the fact remains. They don't even focus much on what's to be taught anymore.
Right.
Now they focus on how you teach. And above all, it's a kind of training in reading the latest memo about
it's on how you should feel in any situation.
Yeah,
Not
and so
what
that's
you should
all.
know, but
and
how
that
you should
means
feel.
that authority moves from the place where it naturally is, in lower school, the student and the teacher and the parent, to somebody who doesn't know those people and doesn't have the experience of working with children all the time. So that's the danger of centralization, if I said earlier last week, the tech companies are intervening in a political dispute in Israel. They're powerful, right? And they've got the data, and artificial intelligence is about to hit the world like a ton of bricks, and that will likely make them more powerful.
I don't know if you saw this story 2 weeks ago, Dr. Arnn. A Russian submarine commander who used an app that tracked his runs was assassinated, probably by a Ukrainian partisan, because he's the guy who shelled the island and destroyed a lot of Ukrainian lives. And he put that up on the web, and the Ukrainians just tracked, or someone just tracked him and killed him, because it's data. All data is public. That's what people need to understand. Everything that you put on your phone is public to the people who have access to it.
Yeah, and we should, by the way, increase the protections, legal protections against that. I mean, I was reading something about the Twitter files this morning, and, the White House, that's what that court case is about that Gorsuch wrote the opinion in. The government is telling social media companies what to publish. And that is the clearest and the worst offense against the First Amendment.
It's not even close, but the left is pretending that it is. You cannot have viewpoint discrimination. Jay Bhattacharya, because of you, came and spent an hour with me. What a great, fascinating conversation that was, and we even said nice things about you behind your back.
Yep.
But he was censored. I cannot believe they censored Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah, and see, Francis Collins, whom I know a little bit, and who wrote a fine book about Christianity and genetics, is apparently a strong Christian. He called for the suppression of those guys, Bhattacharya and Atlas and Kuldorf and Serena Gupta from Oxford. And the truth is, they're much better experts on epidemiology than he is. he makes the point often, he's a chemist. That's not his deal, right? But they're fringe, he says, right? And that's the government deciding who's fringe and who's not.
And that is as unacceptable as it is obviously unacceptable. And people should know that viewpoint and content discrimination from the get-go, for as long as we've had a First Amendment, and since the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, may not be practiced by any agency of the government, especially not the federal government, but all of it.
Over the past 100 years, America has pursued an ambitious foreign policy directed by faceless bureaucrats. While some of those departures were justified, American foreign policy is shifting. What began as the attempt of a free people to protect themselves has become ruled by those who seek to impose their ideals around the globe. But how did we get here? In Hillsdale College's new free online course, American Foreign Policy, Michael Anton has the answers. Anton is a lecturer in politics at Hillsdale College, who served at the National Security Council during both the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, and he'll be your guide through the history of American foreign policy. Learn about the founders' vision of foreign policy and how progressivism and empire have eroded those principles. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course.
Welcome back, America. Dr. Larry Arnn is my guest, president of Hillsdale College, all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. And if you're just picking up that we are doing the world crisis at some leisure, but not slow enough, go back and listen to the first two episodes on this, and we'll continue for many weeks. Dr. Arnn, on page 14 of my edition, Churchill says, Lord Salisbury was followed by Mr. Balfour. The new Prime Minister, Balfour, never had a fair chance. He succeeded only to an exhausted inheritance. Indeed, his wisest course would have been to get out of office as decently, as quietly, and above all, as quickly as possible. I wrote down Rishni next to that. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right. He, it's the situation back then was like the situation now. Problems were accumulating. Balfour was elected on the morrow of the Boer War, and that was a troubled war for Britain. They won, sort of, but it wasn't great. Churchill served in it himself, did one of his bravest things in the middle of it, but it didn't leave everybody fat and happy. The war in the Sudan, in which Churchill was, did do that, although Churchill had reservations about it because the use of modern weapons was horrific to him. But so Balfour comes in, and the world is just changing really fast now. And Balfour was not elected. I mean, first of all, there wasn't an election. He just took Salisbury's place. And so he didn't really have a mandate to deal with the world. And the way you work those out is party platforms advanced in elections. And in Britain, especially because elections can be at any time, and back then may not be longer than 7 years. Now it's 5. So he had an exhausted inheritance, Churchill says. And Churchill, as a witty thing, well, maybe it's a subtle thing. He says that there were some young people in the party who should have been given their heads.
Yep.
Well, of course, he was one of them.
Yep.
And what he wanted to do was, Britain is rich and powerful, and it just won a very difficult war against South Africa and was not really hampered or harmed by that war. We should turn our wealth to helping people, everybody, have a chance to have some security, join the middle class, have some retirement. And so he wanted the Conservative Party to go that way. And there was an alternative plan by Joseph Chamberlain, who was Neville Chamberlain's father. And he was a dynamite guy, and he'd been, as we've talked before, closely associated with Churchill's father. And Joe Chamberlain came up with a different plan. And that plan was, we're going to introduce tariffs for all nations not members of the empire. And the great conversion in the Conservative Party in Britain itself in the middle of the 19th century had been to become a free trade Party. And as I've explained before, that was a class-ridden thing, right? The landed gentry, the peers, they were property owners. They grew food for a living, and there were taxes on the importation of food that transferred wealth from ordinary people to those rich people. And the Conservative Party shed all that. And so Chamberlain wanted to go back to it in a different way, to unite the empire. And Churchill and the young ones opposed that very strongly, and Churchill eventually left the party over it in 1904. And so just that fundamental thing, right, that argument inside the Conservative Party, but also all over the country, that argument is raging, right? And poor Balfour has got to try to ride herd on that.
And he's got a coalition, and a coalition is difficult. But what's interesting, by getting out, and we have only a minute till the break, by getting out, he just willed that same problem to the Liberals when they came in, which was always a coalition as well between the people who wanted to act against Germany and those who were pacifists.
Well, not pacifists. They were, the word for them was Little Englanders.
Little Englanders, yes.
They wanted, they were, by the way, if we could get either faction of the Liberal Party in those days, or for that matter, the Conservative Party, in charge of America today, there'd be a huge improvement.
Oh, my goodness.
But they were, and see these big issues that come up, and, the turbulence in the world, Churchill is at pains in this chapter to explain. That's, the greatest war in history to that time is impending, and it would lead then to the greatest war ever, up to now at least. That's just one thing.
Up to now, at least, which is why we're coming right back to talk about the German Navy law, because what Germany did to England at the turn of the 20th century is what China is doing to the United States right now, putting it in an untenable position. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. In Chapter 2, titled The Milestones to Armageddon, Winston Churchill lays out in The World Crisis what Germany did to precipitate the first great war of the 20th century. In a flamboyant speech in 1904, the German emperor had styled himself the Admiral of the Atlantic. All sorts of sober-minded people in England began to be profoundly disquieted. What did Germany want this great navy for? Against whom except us? Could she measure it, match it, or use it? Can't that be applied immediately to the People's Republic of China, Dr. Arnn, in 2023 when we are talking?
The Japanese ambassador to China had an article in the Wall Street Journal this week. That man is Rahm Emanuel of Barack Obama administration fame. And what he says is a very remarkable thing and sounds like a great idea to me. He says that we should let the Japanese do ship repair of our Pacific Fleet ships so they don't have to come all the way home, because ship repairs are backed up in America for more than a year. And that means every vessel that has to go in for repair is lost. Then he says a shocking thing in the middle of it, which is in 2025, China is going to have 400 ships come online, 400. And they're outbuilding us 2-to-1, and right now our Navy has 241 hulls, active ships. So we're soon to be outnumbered by more than 2-to-1, and they're building twice as fast.
It is the German Navy law. And I'd like you at this point to step back. We're not making this up. We have been here before. Germany did this to Great Britain and ended up in a world war. China has done it to us, only unlike the Brits, we're not keeping up like the Brits did in 1904, 5, 6 because of Lloyd George and Winston Churchill changing their mind about the need for domestic rearmament. Is that a fair summary?
That's right. And in the next chapter, we will see that we have an amazing display of a government functioning beautifully and skillfully. And Churchill is at the point of it as regards the Navy. But today, what are we doing, Once in a while you read some heart-rending article by somebody who says that America is not a serious country anymore. Bill Maher is fond of saying that. There are enormous questions of freedom pending all over the world and huge powers growing up to to oppose us, and we're fighting about pronouns. And that's a luxury that we may soon find we're not able to afford.
Dr. Arnn, 2 weeks ago, a statistic came out, 40% of our attack submarines. Now, the only domain in which we have a clear-cut superiority over the Chinese is under the water. But 40% of our attack submarines are in dry dock and in need of repair. That is not a serious country.
Yeah. And we need to, Mike Gallagher, who's a very good member of Congress, he comes on your show, right? I think.
Yes, often.
Yeah. He says that basically what we have to do is build a lot of ships and airplanes and missiles and all of those things, right? Because they can strike from afar, and, any battle that we have. See, our position is exactly like Britain's, but a few differences. Britain is a small island off the coast of the center of the world, Europe at that time. And so its separation and connection to Europe was fundamental to its both becoming a free country, because navies are not very good for oppressing people at home, and also to be a powerful country, because once you've got a big navy, you can go anywhere in the world. And so the Chinese are building such a navy. Now, we're different from Britain, too, because we are farther away, but you have to qualify that some by the fact that weapons can strike so much farther and faster now than they could back then. So that's right. The opening parts of any war, big war that the United States is involved in, will be in the beginning a naval and air war. And that's just the facts. That's just how it is.
And I want to compare what we have done to what Great Britain did. In 1905, this is quoting Churchill from Chapter 2, in 1905, Britain built 4 ships, dreadnought category, Germany 2. In 1906, Britain decreased her program to 3 ships, and Germany increased her program to 3 ships. In 1907, Britain further decreased her program to 2 ships, and Germany further increased her program to 4 ships. With the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, Winston Churchill could see what they were doing and what the Brits were not doing until he and Lloyd George teamed up and said, okay, this must stop.
In the next chapter, there's a very dramatic, Chapter 3, there's a very dramatic, Churchill describes the moment of his change. He learned that the German army was preparing to attack to the west through Belgium, which they had a treaty not to do. And he learned that they were likely to prosper in that attack. And then he sees, if the German army is decisively superior to the French army, which it had become, maybe that's enough to conquer France and maybe not, but it's certainly true that on an even battlefield, the German army is bigger and better equipped. Well, compare that to the little bitty English army. And that means if Germany could dominate the seas and get its army ashore in Britain, it would be over as soon as that happened. And indeed, Churchill himself faced that prospect in 1940, and the plans were that as a first step, they were going to have to give up London and all of southern England because they couldn't defend. And that's when they had naval superiority, and air superiority was in question. So they proved that by the skin of their teeth they had enough airplanes to stop that, but barely enough.
Now here's the key question, Dr. Arnn. Britain, Churchill writes, has been made to feel that hands were being laid upon the very foundation of her existence, what you just noted, that it's an island nation with this. Swiftly, surely, methodically, a German navy was coming into being at our doors, which must expose us to dangers only to be warded off by strenuous exertions and by a vigilance almost as tense as that of actual war. They get there in time because things are slower then. Do you think we've run out of time already?
Well, Mike Gallagher wrote an article I liked called The Porcupine in the Wall Street Journal, and in that article he says that Germany is going to surpass us. China is going to surpass us. By the way, there are similarities between...
Oh, boy, are there ever.
...modern Germany. Nationalistic, intelligent, advanced. They have some things in common. I've been saying
with a ruthless and vain leader.
That's it. Yeah, and he's a very tough man. He's known time in the Gulag. So and what Gallagher thinks in that article is that they're going to pass us, China, and so what we can do right now is build a defense of what we hold, and what we hold is not just the mainland of the United States; it's also Japan and South
and
Korea,
Australia and India,
New Zealand, and one hopes and prays Taiwan. And so we should get ourselves ready to make it very costly for them, at a minimum, to make the calculation uncertain whether they can move against those places. And the Japanese are very worried, right? And they're behaving like the kind of allies that we would deserve if we were doing a better job. So we should, imminently, now, yesterday would be better, we should start building a way to deter them from using their grown-up naval power as an aggressive thing against their immediate neighbors.
But the predicate of that, in England at the turn of the 20th century and now in the United States at the turn of the 21st, are a shared understanding of and an agreement between the two major parties that this is unacceptable. I don't know that we have that, Dr. Arnn.
No. The American government is extensively dysfunctional right now, and that's because it's riven by disputes about those fundamental things that we talked about in those court cases. And so what do we do? It is true that there is at least some bipartisan support for resistance to China, and one hopes and prays that it will grow. But, we will know when we get to it, if we ever stop reading Winston Churchill, which I hope we don't, when we read the Second World War, especially the first volume, we will see that that Churchill's first argument in the 1930s was, should we rearm at all? Because the official policy of all the major parties, and Churchill's Conservative Party included, was disarmament. And so he had to win that argument first. And then after that, there ensued a long argument, are we building enough, and are we building it fast and effective and efficiently enough?
And
that argument goes on for
this is
6
jumping
years.
way ahead. We signed a lot of treaties, Great Britain, the United States, with the hostile powers in the 20s and the 30s, and we abided by all of them. Turns out the Axis powers abided by none of them, and therefore we were at a significant disadvantage as people of goodwill versus despots.
Yeah. Hitler was, there's some things about him compared to Stalin that make him seem a little naive. And one of those things is he renounced the arms provisions of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. And he was already building, Germany had, by the way, never ceased building weapons against the treaty. Indeed, they built a lot of them in the Soviet Union, which hid the operation from the West. But he just made a public announcement about it. The Chinese are way too clever, right? They probably would not announce anything. They just do it. And Stalin was like that, too.
Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about the deep naivete of America and its belief in being a superpower without any equal. It's a naivete that Germany used against Britain on Britain's part about there being an unsinkable island. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 2 of The World Crisis. You ought to go and get this. We'll be in Chapter 3 next week. Stay tuned. Dr. Arnn will be right back.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding. And we want you, or your son or daughter, to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dr. Larry Arnn and I are going into the world crisis in depth, chapter by chapter, for many weeks. And in the end of chapter 2, Dr. Arnn, he writes about the Germans. Ah, foolish, diligent Germans, working so hard, thinking so deeply, marching and countermarching on the parade grounds of the fatherland, poring over long calculations, fuming in newfound prosperity, discontented amid the splendor of mundane success. How many bulwarks to your peace and glory did you not, with your own hands, successively tear down? In other words, Germany had what it wanted, equality on the world stage, but it couldn't stop. Do you see the same thing happening with the PRC?
Well, probably, yeah. They, it's of course, that's a very big phenomenon, the PRC, and China itself is a big phenomenon. But, one never knows. Was it so when Deng Xiaoping and that crowd reformed the Chinese economy by opening the special economic zones, which has led to contemporary Chinese power, was that part of a plan to dominate the world? I don't know. It is clear that they were trying to save themselves. They watched the Soviet Union collapse, and they're way behind. And so they thought, and they've done it. They thought, we're going to open up, and we're going to keep control. And right now, all of the steps are toward greater control. They've a lot of the things that tempted American companies to go over there and invest a lot of assets, which, by the way, I'm pleased to say most American companies have been reluctant to do inside China proper. They have big investments there, but they haven't bet the farm on them. Now they're making that harder, and the law is cracking down all kinds of ways. I mean, it's China is a very comprehensive surveillance state now. It's sort of 1984 TV screens that are in every home, every place where you can go almost. Now that's just ubiquitous, right?
There was a story this week on facial recognition for TSA, and I shuddered. Because a senator objected and the senator had to submit. And that is just data. And data that is stored anywhere is available to everyone who has better software. I just don't think people understand the peril in which we are vis-a-vis a surveillance state like China.
On this recent trip, I entered the United States and Britain, and I didn't have to show any document. I never got my passport out. When I went into Turkey, I did, which means that they're more backward, which is also another way more advanced. But, just think what that means. And my dear wife had some contradiction between two documents. And so she was recognized, too, but then she was sent to the long line and had to wait 30 minutes. Ooh. But I just breezed through.
I hope you went with her and stood in line with her.
I stood outside on the other side of the glass, keeping watch. And there was a guy there in the New York at Kennedy Airport immigration place, and he was a customs official, and he was loud and aggressive with people, and I didn't like that.
Do you know how many TSA agents we have?
No.
47,000.
Yeah.
47,000 watching our airports, but none mandated to watch our schools. I am astonished where we are at this point in the United States, Dr. Arnn, and I don't know that we're going to get out of this. I'm a this book makes me a pessimist. Does it make you a pessimist or an optimist?
No, it's a glorious story. Churchill is good proof against trouble, because he always expected it to be hell, and he always expected to prevail. And so that's one must reason about that, of course, but also one must cultivate that attitude.
Well, I'm going to tease next week. What we do not have is a Lloyd George who will come from the wrong side to the right side and bring with him much of the wrong side. Is that fairly put about Lloyd George?
Yeah, it is. And the good news there is that I think you're right that we do not have one that is apparent, but that doesn't mean we do not have one. Who expected the rise of Donald Trump? And God knows what's going to happen from here, but he came out of nowhere. And
I'm looking for Democrats. I know people say Mark Warner, Angus King. There are a few, but someone's got to cross the line. And we'll talk about that next week. And don't go, America, you've never heard of Agadir? I might not even be pronouncing it. Next week, we're going to talk about Agadir. And it happened in 1911. So it's been 112 years. And it matters like it happened yesterday. So do not miss it. All the Hillsdale Dialogues are collected on iTunes under Hillsdale Dialogue at HughForHillsdale.com. The Churchill Project of Hillsdale is remarkable, and if you go to hillsdale.edu, you can find an application for admission to the fall class of 2024, which I encourage you to go and fill out soon, because it's going to be hard to get into Hillsdale next year like it is this year. But I'll be back next week with Dr. Arnn, Chapter 3 of the World Crisis. Thank you, Dr. Arnn. Thank all of you for listening. Thank you, Adam and Generalissimo and Harley. Thanks all of you. I'm Hugh Hewitt.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.